Explorer's Log, Day 58. I'm deep in the dungeon which has mystery, in search of the holy artifact. New Pokemon Mystery Dungeon video game. My search has been fruitless thus far, and with 4 years of no Mystery Dungeon content, I may not last much longer. We shall see what today brings.
It's just what I've been searching for. A new Mystery Dungeon video game. Hey, where'd all the Pokemon go?
Hello my friendos, we have a special topic for today. It's Shiren the Wanderer Mystery Dungeon. So this is a video game series that I believe has existed since the 90s or some such. And it is a part of the Mystery Dungeon series by Spike Chunsoft, of which I think the most popular and well-known variant is Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. That is the one I'm most familiar with, certainly. I've played all of the major Pokemon Mystery Dungeon releases, except for the goddamn Wii download exclusive game that was only in Japan. Haven't played that. Don't really plan to. I heard it was mid, so not really planning on checking that out, and don't really have a feasible way of doing so either, so let's ignore that one. But I've certainly played the rest of the series, and wow, I love it so much. I've made several videos about Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. The series currently is not doing anything. The last release was a remake of the first game, Pokemon Rescue Team DX, in 2020 on the Switch, so it's been 4 years since then. And coincidentally, the title Shiren the Wanderer, The Mystery Dungeon of Serpent Coil Isle released on Pokemon Day this year. And it actually got a really good reception, very high Metascore, I believe the highest Metascore for that series. And I thought, hell, you know what? It's finally time. I'm deprived of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Might as well check out this variant of it. I've never played any other type of Mystery Dungeon game, so sure, why not? Now is as good a time as any. And while it is, it's not a replacement for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, it's actually a really freaking good time, and one that I would recommend. So let's get into details. This is the 6th Shiren game, and I have no context for what previous entries were like. For this entry, it maintains one thing that I know about this series, which is that it is a roguelike, unlike the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, which are linear story-based games. This is a roguelike. Essentially, that means you have one main dungeon that you are progressing throughout the whole game, and if you die, you lose all of your items, your money, and your levels. So it's a lot harsher than the Pokemon version. In Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, you kind of like grind levels if you get stuck. There's kind of ways of cheesing the system. In Shiren, though, it functions quite differently. So that's basically the pitch, is that it is a roguelike. You can keep/store some of your items in specific spots, but those are pretty infrequent and situational. So even though you are restarting every single run, there are ways of assisting you along. You aren't starting totally from square one. There are ways you can carry over things from previous runs to future runs, which I'll get into in more detail shortly. I'll just touch on the game's visuals. I will say it's probably one of the most lacking aspects. The visuals look decent. They're okay, but not really AAA quality. The character models and animations are nice, but pretty simple. One visual feature this game employs is a depth of field effect, but I found the implementation kind of confusing because it doesn't really make sense. The game doesn't really have like a realistic toy style, because basically when a game is using a tilt-shift perspective, it gives it a particular look and feel. So something like the Octopath Traveler games has a tilt-shift depth of field, which sort of makes the whole game look like it's taking place in a diorama. It just gives it that feel. It makes everything look sort of small, and it's also employed in Link's Awakening, where the characters are sort of supposed to look like toys, so it helps to sell that effect. However, in this game, it doesn't really add that much. It makes it look a little fancier, maybe? It doesn't really sell a specific visual illusion. and I don't think it's really all that necessary. With that said, the way it's implemented is also flawed. This is an issue that was also in Link's Awakening with the field of view, where it's basically just the top and bottom of the screen has a band where it's blurry, and that's how they achieve a depth of field effect, but that's not really how depth of field works spatially. I'm not really equipped to explain this in detail, but videos have been done on Link's Awakening and how that depth of field effect is not accurate. So the same thing applies here. So that was something that's just a little odd. It doesn't detract from the visuals, but I don't think it adds to it all that much either. If they were going for a sort of toy style like Link's Awakening, I think they should have reflected that more in the character models and the environments, which are all semi-realistic. I don't know, it didn't totally work. The game looks nice, but for a $60 release, it's not quite exceptional. Even if you compare it with Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX, that game is actually far more stylized. It's made to look like a watercolor painting, similar to how the game artwork was for the original game. So it actually makes sense and goes alongside with visuals that have been associated with the game since the start of the series. So I actually really like that effect, and I think that game overall looks a lot nicer and has a more consistent and enjoyable visual style. Either way, though, Shiren looks pretty nice. Not bad. Not great though. Something else that isn't executed perfectly in Shiren is the music. It employs Japanese style, I guess you would call it. I didn't find the melodies or the execution of it particularly memorable. It's not bad, some of it's pretty good, but it doesn't stick in my head the way some of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon tracks have. So that's another thing where I didn't love it, but it's okay. It's decent background music for your runs through the dungeons. I should also mention that the game in general has very Japanese-inspired character designs and mythology and lore. The main characters look very anime. The creatures feel very inspired by Japanese folklore, as far as I could tell. That gives it a distinct flair, I guess, and I do like that aspect of it. One thing that did surprise me when playing Shiren for the first time is how similar the core gameplay actually is to Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. I mean, I had no knowledge of the series beforehand, but it did surprise me to see how many familiar mechanics there are. The hunger mechanic is here, where after every step you lose a bit of hunger, but you also gain some health, and you have to keep items with you in order to regain your hunger. In the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, they are apples. In the Shiren series, they are onigiri, so that's another clearly Japanese element in the game. But yeah, the core gameplay in terms of the way you interact with the environment and do battle is extremely similar to Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, so I felt very comfortable with that, and it was quite nice to just be able to slip back into that style of gameplay where you're going through every floor, looking for the stairs, collecting items, and using them strategically to defeat enemies, etc., etc. So it's a really fun gameplay loop that I really have enjoyed in the past Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games that I've played, and to experience it again here, but in a totally different context, was pretty cool. I guess it's sort of like how the Warriors games are similar across entries regardless of what series they're adapting, like how if you've played Fire Emblem Warriors, it's pretty similar in terms of the core gameplay to Hyrule Warriors, since it's made by the same company and using the same gameplay concepts. Pretty similar idea here. I'd say the main difference from the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games is that this is indeed a roguelike. Most roguelites, or I don't know, I guess people use roguelike and roguelite pretty interchangeably. I guess roguelite is just a more forgiving version of roguelike is the idea. So my favorite roguelite that I've played is Hades. In part that's due to how different each run is, and even if you have an unsuccessful run, you will, get items that you can use to upgrade your character to make subsequent runs easier. That's something that isn't in Shiren the Wanderer quite as much. So when you start out, you really do just start back at the beginning without any of your stuff or levels when you die. However, as you go along, you unlock things which make subsequent runs easier. What started making a big difference was when you unlock the different companions. In the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, you always have your partner character alongside you in the dungeons, which does make the game a lot easier. So not having any helper AI characters at the start of Shiren definitely makes it a lot more challenging, and you do have to be a lot more strategic in your use of items and how you progress through the environment. In Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, I tended to always just go for the stairs because it's like, well, I might as well just get out of here. But in Shiren, it's more like, okay, should I stay on this level to try and fight more enemies to get more levels, or clear every room to look for items because I might get a revival item or a good healing item. So there's more to think about, I would say, in general, because the stakes are just much higher. The main dungeon has 30 floors, but they are broken up by different towns. In this, they don't act as checkpoints, but you can visit an inn to replenish your health or hunger. And you can also find storage houses to store items for future runs. This is where you'll often find story sections, so that gives you an incentive to keep doing runs. Even if you don't make it all the way to floor 30, you still will likely get a new cutscene progressing one of the side stories with one of the side characters. The reward for completing these, I guess, mini quest lines is sometimes you will get access to a new partner character that can join you in the dungeon. They don't join you immediately, you just find them in the dungeon sometimes, and they will join you. And I found them to be incredibly helpful. That's how I ended up beating the game, is by having a partner AI with me to help me. That really does make a huge difference. They level up alongside you, so they become, more powerful as you go along. And some of them have unique abilities, like there's a pig that can throw rocks. I should say that many of the items from the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games that I'm familiar with, such as rocks, wands, and seeds, all have equivalents in Shiren the Wanderer. For instance, grass is basically the equivalent of seeds, so those are consumable items that give you a specified effect. There's also scrolls, which are the equivalent of orbs, which tends to affect a whole room. They might confuse all the targets in a single room, stuff like that. You basically have the exact same mechanics that are in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, just with a different coat of paint. One other thing I liked about Shiren is that when you are selecting a dungeon to choose, or sometimes there are branches in the path, it'll show you what percentage of players have been able to complete that specific path. So that'll help you if you're like me. I was trying to avoid ones that were going to be too difficult, so if it only has a 3% completion rate, I'm probably going to avoid it unless I really am up for the challenge. So that's a nice feature. Another gameplay mechanic that I liked is that you can get rescued from a dungeon if you die by another player online. You also used to be able to do that in the older games by using a code. In Pokemon Mystery Dungeon on Switch, I believe you had unlimited amount of rescues to use. However, in Shiren you only get 3, so that's something to think about. I did also rescue some other players by using the online message board, which was pretty fun, and you get some reward points that you can use on other rescues, like leveling yourself up. They don't carry over to the main game, but they are useful for if you're going on a difficult rescue and you want an extra advantage. You can also rescue yourself, which is kind of funny. I will say that feature is not available in certain dungeons, and I guess that just makes those more difficult, so you got to be up for the challenge if you want to attempt those. In terms of the story, I've mentioned it before, but most of it takes place in little self-contained cutscenes with bespoke characters. I liked these well enough. I like the main cast, okay. I would say the best character is your talking ferret companion named Copa. He's pretty cool, like him quite a bit, but there's some fun other characters. The story here really is quite light, nothing too deep. In terms of stakes, the story actually has fairly low stakes compared to Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, which is funny. Basically, you are trying to get to the top of the mountain, and that's basically it. There's also a plot line where there is on the mainland there is a drought, and that is something that comes into play later in the storyline. But yeah, it's basically just these individual cutscenes with the different characters that you eventually are able to recruit. So yeah, it's fine. The story's fine. I like that it uses the same emote effects that are in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. That was pretty cool to see, and it also has the character portraits, which are also in Pokemon. So lots of similarities there in the cutscenes, and the way they play out is also quite similar, but less emotionally effective, much less going on, much less story in general, which is kind of surprising, I guess. I mean, it's more gameplay focused since it's a roguelike, but even still, I would say Pokemon is just far more story focused, which is something that I really like about it, but that isn't really present here. So if you're looking for something to replicate the experience of the story found in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, you're not really going to find it in Shiren the Wanderer, which I guess is too bad, but you know, it's its own thing, and the gameplay is really strong, and that's where the focus is. So that's just how it is. So that's what I thought about Shiren the Wanderer of The Legend of Serpent Coil Isle. I don't know. These games have pretty unwieldy titles, I'll note. They're a bit of a mouthful. But that led me to wanting to try another Shiren title once I beat the main story. I'm kind of into this little series now. What else do we have on offer? And on Switch, there is actually another Mystery Dungeon game that was released. Shiren the Wanderer, The Tower of Fortune and the Dice of Fate. And what's funny about this one is that they felt the need to write Shiren the Wanderer twice on the Switch icon. I don't know why, but it's kind of funny. This was released in 2020, and it's a port of a Nintendo DS game, which was also released on the PlayStation Vita and Steam. So what's great about this one is that you get some really nice pixel art graphics, which are from the DS. So, you know, my most treasured memories with Pokemon Mystery Dungeon are from the DS games, the Explorer games. So I enjoy seeing the DS visual style in a Mystery Dungeon game. It fits quite well. The music is also pretty good. I feel similar to it as I do to Serpent Coil Isle, in that it's just good, not really great for my tastes. But this one is a different take on the Shiren the Wanderer series. I believe that this game selling so well on Switch is what led Spike Chunsoft, the developer, to make Serpent Coil Isle. I believe I read that somewhere, so that's great. I guess people really enjoyed this one on Switch. I'm glad I went back to try it. I'll also note that it is $20 as opposed to $60, which is what Serpent Coil Isle is at. And honestly, I guess in terms of content, I think they're probably comparable. Just with Serpent Coil Isle, you get, you know, it's more modern and has a fresh coat of paint, I guess. But the pixel graphics in Tower of Fortune are also really nice. So, you know, if you're looking to enter the series, I'd say either of these are a pretty decent option. And they're both on Switch, which is my primary gaming device, so that's why I checked them out there. And I don't think the other Shiren titles are widely available on Switch or other consoles. I don't think you can find them super easily outside of emulation. One thing that I found interesting about this title is that it is far more forgiving in the opening hours than Serpent Coil Isle is. Serpent Coil Isle kind of just smacks you immediately. It doesn't really give you any help at the start, and then you gradually unlock things that help you along the way. With Tower of Fortune, how it starts is that there's actually quite a few ways to build up funds and items, so you can build up a pretty decent collection early on in the game. However, after you've beaten 3 mini dungeons, it unlocks the main dungeon, which is significantly harder. I'd say it's harder than the dungeon in Serpent Coil Isle, the main dungeon. And one thing that did throw me off about Tower of Fortune is it does contain mechanics that were not found in Serpent Coil Isle. Specifically, the one that really messed me up was the night mechanic. So basically, in certain dungeons, once a certain amount of time has passed, it will switch from day to night. And in night mode, the monsters are way tougher and can one-shot you. And you need a torch in order to see anything around you. And you also need the torch in order to read scrolls, which are super essential, especially if you want to use an escape scroll to leave the dungeon. And if you don't have a torch, which sometimes you might not because they can be kind of difficult to find. I mean, I don't know about that, but I did have trouble finding them on some runs. And you're kind of just screwed at that point because you can't just step somewhere wrong to get one shot, which is great. That's so fun. I did get past it eventually, but it's a pretty steep learning curve for that mechanic, and I did not feel well prepared for it. I mean, the game does give you a tutorial, but you got to be really careful at night. I will say that the story does have a better hook. You're trying to save a girl in the village who is dying, and you're trying to change her fate by going up this tower. So that's a bit more of an interesting hook. It is a little more mystical, has some fun stuff going on, so I appreciate that. The story is also very minimal, as is in the other Shiren game, Serpent Coil, but it's a little bit better, I'd say, here. A little bit more engaging. There's also an online ranking system, so that's kind of neat. You can get ranked. One thing that does slightly bother me about the presentation is it does have the somewhat awkward thing where it has pixel graphics, but then just totally clear text, which just looks a little bit wrong, but it's not that big a deal. I also found that the companions are a lot more fragile in this game. They can be killed pretty easily if you're not careful, so that's a big difference. There's also a specific companion where you have to take him with you through the dungeon, and if he dies and you go to the next level, you just get stopped and you have to go back to the start, and you have to have a healing item with you to revive him, and if you don't, you just can't progress. So that's another mechanic in there. This is kind of harsh. You're also limited to 2 companions, whereas you are not in Serpent Coil Isle. This game also has the mechanic where you can get rescued if you fall in a dungeon. It also has the limit of 3. I did find it took slightly longer to get rescued, but that's probably just because it's an older game and has a less active online community. There's also no way to rescue yourself in this game like there is in Serpent Coil Isle. The item selection is quite a bit different in this title as well. You have a wider variety, I would say, one of which is the Undo Grass, which is super useful. When you die, it gives you the option to revive or escape from the dungeon and keep all your items, including your gear. I haven't mentioned that for either game, but I need to mention that this game has a big focus on equipment. You get swords, shields, and then bracelet things, which can give you upgraded stats. And so you do lose that if you die, but in the Tower of Dice, there are ways of retaining it. You can place a tag on it, and it goes to a lost and found if you die. And then if you are able to escape from a dungeon using an escape scroll or undo grass, or I don't know, there's a couple other ways to get out of a dungeon, you also get to keep it alongside your other items. In Serpent Coil Isle, what happens is if you die with an item, it can go to a shop where you can buy it back, but that isn't unlocked until after you beat the main dungeon, and they are very high prices. This game also has some mini games in it, one of which is like a pushing block puzzle, so that's kind of cool. You get rewarded with items for that, which is a nice bonus. That's an alright addition. I like that one. So yeah, I liked the Tower of Fortune quite a bit. I think Serpent Coil Isle is slightly better and is a better introduction to the series just because it's more forgiving in places. And while the Tower of Fortune starts out more simple, it introduces things like the night mechanic that kind of make it really difficult if you're not paying close attention. Though it is more expensive, if you're looking for the best starting point, I would say Serpent Coil Isle is that. But, you know, Tower of Fortune is also a very good, slightly more budget option that you could go with if you're looking to enter the series, which I should say I do recommend if you are a fan of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon gameplay. And given that it's been so long since the last Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, I think, you know, this is as good a time as any to jump into this other Mystery Dungeon series, which does not have all the same appeal of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, of course, but it does have its own unique identity and value to it, and I really have enjoyed playing through these titles. I have quite a few hours in both of them because they're just really fun, and they reward your skill in ways that the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games don't, since they're roguelikes, and it takes quite a bit of effort to get through a dungeon in them. The sense of reward you get when you do finally beat the dungeon is really great. I really am glad I took the chance on this series. It's really fun. I like a lot of the enemy design as well. This thing, the mammal, I like the mammal quite a bit. It's a pretty good enemy. Look at the mammal. Most of the enemies, I would say, carry over between the two titles. So yeah, there's actually quite a lot of Mystery Dungeon titles to check out. These are the two most obvious ones that are on Switch that aren't the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game. Very, very cool series. I believe that both titles were financially successful. Serpent Coil Isle is still getting updated. It was updated recently, I think, with new dungeons and new content, so that's pretty neat. I hope that the success of this title encourages the market to see that, you know, there's a demand for even more Pokemon Mystery Dungeon titles. That is what I'm most invested in at the end of the day. I do like exploring the Shiren series, but Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series is definitely where it's at. I think the story does do a lot of heavy lifting in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, and that's something that you don't really get as much in Shiren, so it's just a different experience, but Pokemon is the one I want to see more of personally. So hopefully the Pokemon Company and Spike Chunsoft get together at some point soon, have some meetings, and we get a new one. I would take a remake of Explorers. I made a video a couple months ago where I speculated that the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series may in fact be dead. You know, looking back on it, I think that's a bit premature to say that. It has been 4 years since the last one, but I don't think that excludes the option of it continuing sometime in the future. Spike Chunsoft did just release this new Mystery Dungeon game, so presumably they wouldn't have time to develop a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon simultaneously, so their resources are going elsewhere at the moment. But, you know, at some point in the future, that would be pretty great to see a new one. A remake of Explorers would be phenomenal. I think there would be a big demand for that. That would be pretty great. That, for me, is like my version of the Paper Mario fans freaking out about getting a Thousand Year Door remake. That would be my version of that if we got an Explorers of Sky remake. In the style of Rescue Team DX would be pretty cool. I'd also like to see, you know, also another option would be HD 2D. We haven't gotten that before from a Mystery Dungeon title, I don't believe, but that would look pretty great, and you'd still get to retain that sprite work. I've mentioned that before. I don't think the door is necessarily shut on the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, and even if it is, it's clear that there are other Mystery Dungeon games that I can go back to and get quite a lot of enjoyment from, certainly in a gameplay perspective. Not quite as much in a story or aesthetic perspective, but the gameplay is extremely strong and better in places, I would say, certainly than the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games. Certainly quite a lot more challenging, but also quite a bit more rewarding in places. So give it a go if you're looking for that. It is hilarious that the new Shiren Mystery Dungeon title literally came out on Pokemon Day this year. I have to imagine that was a total coincidence, but even still, it's kind of funny. All right, folks. Yeah, cool. Check it out. Give it a go. Shiren.